Welcome. Let's review what we've studied about process cost systems for manufacturers and how they cost out their inventory. To do so, turn to example 3 in your lecture notes and we'll get started. Abe Pharmaceutical Company uses a process costing system and uses the weighted average method. Inventory begins in the milling department and is transferred to the pressing department for further processing. In the milling department, all materials are added at the beginning of the process, and inventory on December 1st included 2,000 units, 30% complete as to direct labor and overhead. Costs associated with beginning work in process are direct material $4,000, direct labor $2,000, factory overhead $3,000. So notice that we're not given a percentage completion for direct materials, but we are told that they are added at the beginning of the process, which means these units in beginning work in process are 100% complete as to direct materials. Abe started 5,000 units into production during December. Costs incurred during December included direct materials used costing $24,000, direct labor cost of $34,000, and factory overhead applied totaling $51,000. There were 4,000 units remaining in the milling department on December 31st, which were 25% complete as to direct labor and overhead. Once again, these units are 100% complete as to materials, since all of the material is added at the beginning of the process. First, calculate the equivalent units of production for direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. When you account for or calculate equivalent units, it's usually a good idea to just look at the physical flow of units first to make sure you have all of the information that you need. And if you reference your lecture notes, you'll recall that that formula is beginning work in process plus units started equal ending work in process plus units completed. So in other words, all of the units that we worked on, beginning plus what we started currently, are either finished or they're not finished. So we had 2,000 units in beginning work in process inventory. Notice that we're not considering the percentage completion. In this formula, we are just looking at the whole units. We started with 2,000 and we began working on 5,000 more. That is equal to the ending units of 4,000, and we are not told how many were completed. We will need that information in order to calculate the equivalent units of production. But we can see that given the information that we have, the units completed is equal to 3,000 units. Now we can calculate the equivalent units of production. You'll notice that we have two different percentages completion, one for direct materials and one for direct labor and overhead. So we're going to have two columns, one for materials and one for labor and overhead or conversion costs. When you calculate equivalent units, what you're trying to do is figure out the equivalent units completed during the period. So we know that we completed 3,000 units, and by definition, these are 100% complete. So we'll put 3,000 in each column because each one of these 3,000 units needs direct materials, direct labor, and overhead cost assigned to it. But we also completed some of the ending work in process. We are told that the ending units for materials, all material is added at the beginning of the process, and there were 4,000 units. So there's 4,000 equivalent units of production. Conversion costs were only 25% complete. So we had 1,000 equivalent units of production for those ending units. So our equivalent units as to materials is 7,000 units, and our equivalent units of production for conversion costs are 4,000 units. Second, we're asked to compute the total cost per equivalent unit. Now we've gotten the calculation for equivalent units, so what we need to begin with is figure out what will be in our numerator, or costs. When you use the weighted average method, you're going to need to set up two columns, one for direct materials and one for conversion costs. In this example, where there is 1% completion as to materials and another percentage completion as to labor and overhead. This is why we need two columns. And when you use the weighted average method, you always want to take beginning costs, which were given. It says costs associated with beginning work in process are direct material, $4,000, direct labor, $2,000, factory overhead, $3,000. So I added the labor and overhead costs together, $2,000 plus $3,000, to get $5,000. Then during December, we added more cost. We added $24,000 of direct materials, $34,000 of direct labor, and $51,000 of overhead. So the $85,000 of conversion cost is made up of $34,000 of labor and $51,000 of overhead applied. Now we have our numerator. The total cost of materials is $28,000. The conversion cost is $90,000, so we can compute the cost per equivalent unit. We'll take these numbers as our numerator for total cost, and we'll divide by equivalent units, which we calculated initially to be 7,000 for materials and 4,000 for conversion costs. So for materials, each unit should be assigned $4, and for conversion costs, $22.50. That means a finished unit for this production run costs $26.50. What is the cost assigned to the 3,000 units completed during December? Well, we know in this production run, each finished unit should be assigned $26.50, which includes the materials, labor, and overhead applied. 3,000 times $26.50 is $79,500. Now realize the reason this was calculated is this is the amount that is going to go out of the milling department and into the pressing department during December. So if you were to look at that journal entry, you would debit work in process for the pressing department and credit work in process for the milling department. Again, showing that you're taking cost out of milling and putting it into pressing. Now, of course, from here in the pressing department, more costs will be added to the $79,500 and more calculations will be made. 4. What is the value of the ending work in process at the end of December? Now recall that we had 4,000 units, but we can't assign $26.50 to each one of these units because they are not finished. $26.50 is the cost of a finished unit. So the 4,000 units are 100% complete as to materials. So we'll take 4,000 equivalent units times $4, the cost per equivalent unit for materials, and we will assign $16,000 to the ending work in process for materials. For conversion cost, those 4,000 units are only 25% complete. So we'll take 1,000 equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit of $22.50, and we get $22,500. So the total cost assigned to the ending work in process inventory is $38,500. Now this, of course, will become the beginning work in process inventory value at the beginning of January. All right, so that concludes this example. Now go and do some practice yourself, do your recommended homework problems and graded homework problems, and bring questions to class. See you then.